The air inside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. Every seat on the wooden benches was filled, a restless sea of aging faces, curious locals, journalists with recorders balanced on their knees, and camera crews angling for the perfect shot. At the front, beneath the polished Missouri state seal, an elderly man shuffled forward, his wrists bound in steel cuffs. Thomas "Tommy" Whitaker. 74 years old now, his shoulders were hunched, his once dark hair turned to thin wisps of gray. But for many in this small town, his face was a ghost from another life, one they had spent decades trying to forget. As the bailiff called the case, a low murmur swept the courtroom. For some, this was the moment they'd prayed for since 1974. For others, it was an open wound they'd spent 50 years trying to close. The judge adjusted his glasses, his voice steady but heavy with meaning. After 50 years, the truth finally stands trial. Summer 1974. A humid Missouri evening. Crickets screamed from the shadows as a pair of streetlights flickered over Main Street. Teenagers leaned against cars outside Harlan's diner, their laughter echoing across the asphalt. It was a town where everyone knew everyone, and where the idea of real danger felt like something that only happened somewhere else. 17-year-old Debbie Kincaid stepped out of the diner, her bright red sundress swaying in the warm breeze. Her friends called after her. "You sure you don't want to come cruising with us?" She smiled, that soft, easy smile everyone remembered, and shook her head. "Nah. Gotta be home before Mom freaks out." She waved goodbye, disappearing into the humid darkness. It would be the last time any of them ever saw her alive. Present day, courthouse. Debbie's younger sister, Linda, now in her early 60s, sat in the front row gripping a photograph so tightly it had curled at the edges. In it, Debbie smiled in a field of daisies, her long chestnut hair caught mid-laugh. For 50 years, Linda had lived with one question carved into her heart. Who killed my sister? Today, she was finally staring at the man accused of stealing Debbie's future. Discovery. 2 days after Debbie disappeared. The morning sun spilled across Big River State Park, cutting through mist still clinging to the trees. A pair of boys, both barely 12, followed a narrow deer trail, chasing frogs down toward the creek bed. One of them stopped suddenly. "Hey, what's that?" At first, it just looked like a pale shape tangled in the tall grass. But as they drew closer, the world seemed to fall silent around them. A shoe. A ribbon. A hand. Courthouse. A TV reporter whispered into her microphone as the prosecutor shuffled his papers. After decades of frustration, prosecutors believe a single trace of DNA, preserved on a scrap of fabric, has finally solved one of Missouri's most haunting mysteries. The camera panned slowly across the gallery, capturing the generations of faces bound together by loss and memory. Parents who never stopped wondering. Childhood friends now gray-haired, carrying guilt they couldn't name. Everyone here had been touched by Debbie's death in some way. And everyone had an opinion about Tommy Whitaker. Tommy, 1974. Back then, Tommy was just 23 years old. A quiet, wiry mechanic who spent most of his nights working late at Jack's service station, wiping his hands on oil-stained rags and drinking lukewarm cans of Falstaff beer. People in town knew him, but they didn't really know him. Some said he was shy. Others called him strange. He lived in a small trailer on the edge of town, kept to himself, and had a temper that flared without warning. Debbie had been seen at the gas station before, filling up her parents' Chevy, exchanging polite smiles with Tommy behind the counter. Nothing seemed unusual until she vanished. A breakthrough. For decades, there was nothing. No fingerprints. No confession. No answers. But in 2023, a statewide cold case DNA initiative changed everything. When detectives opened the old evidence box, the air smelled faintly of mildew and forgotten time. Inside, they found Debbie's sundress, carefully sealed, untouched since 1974. Underneath her fingernails, they found a trace DNA sample. It was small. Imperfect. Almost degraded beyond use. But it was enough. A match came back, Thomas Whitaker. Courthouse, Tommy speaks. The defense attorney leaned toward Tommy, his voice low. You don't have to say a word. But Tommy's gaze swept over the gallery, settling briefly on Linda Kincaid before darting away. His hands trembled as he spoke, barely above a whisper. I never meant to hurt her. I just wanted to talk to her. Gasps rippled through the room. Reporters scribbled furiously. Linda's grip tightened on Debbie's photograph until her knuckles turned white. For half a century, Jefferson County lived with a question mark. Parents died without knowing. Children grew up with whispered warnings. Whole generations were haunted by the unsolved murder of a girl who never made it home. Now, a single thread of science has pulled a monster out of hiding. The prosecutor adjusts his tie, looking directly at the jury. In 1974, Thomas Whitaker thought he got away with murder. But technology has a memory longer than time. Before Debbie Kincaid became a headline, before her photograph ended up on missing posters stapled to telephone poles, she was simply 17. 17, with her entire life stretching wide and bright ahead of her. Flashback, spring 1974. The Kincaid home sat on a quiet two-lane road just outside DeSoto, Missouri, a modest white clapboard house where you could smell freshly baked peach cobbler drifting from the kitchen window. On Saturday mornings, Debbie would lie on her stomach across her bed, a ballpoint pen between her fingers, scribbling names and doodles into the spiral notebook she called her dream book. Inside, she'd written lists like, Top 10 songs to play at my wedding. Cities I want to see, Nashville, New Orleans, New York. And, in bold letters, become a teacher. She wanted to teach second grade. Little ones, she used to say, before the world teaches them to stop believing in magic. Interview, Linda Kincaid, present day. Archival-style voiceover over slow pans of Debbie's old photographs. Debbie was the glue in our family. Always laughing. Always singing. Mom used to say she came into this world humming. Linda Kincaid, now 63, smiles faintly, tears catching at the corners of her eyes. She had this way of making you feel special, you know? Like you mattered. I was 12 back then. I looked up to her for everything. Flashback, the diner. Friday nights meant Harlan's Diner, neon lights buzzing faintly, the smell of burgers sizzling on the grill, and the jukebox playing Fleetwood Mac's Go Your Own Way. Debbie was always there, perched on a red vinyl stool with her best friend Carolyn Brewer. They'd share a plate of fries, legs swinging beneath the counter, giggling about boys and making big plans. Carolyn later remembered that night clearly. She kept talking about wanting to save up for a used Chevy Nova. She was so excited, you know? We thought we had all the time in the world. The girl everyone knew. Debbie's world was small, but she filled it with color. She worked weekends at the Five and Dime, where she neatly folded blouses and whispered secrets to her co-worker behind the counter. She sang in the church choir every Sunday, her clear alto voice carrying through the sanctuary. She was the eldest of 3 siblings, Linda, 12, and Mark, just 8. She helped Mark with his spelling words, sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet, patient and proud. Her father, George Kincaid, worked long hours at the local quarry, and her mother, Elaine, kept the household running. Money was tight, but the Kincaids were happy in the quiet, ordinary way small-town families often are. Neighbors described Debbie as bright, kind, and grounded. Not the type to get into trouble, one recalled. She was careful, and she always called home if she was gonna be late. That's why, when she didn't come home on June 7, 1974, everyone knew something was wrong. Former classmate. Over grainy yearbook photos. You know, back then, we didn't lock our doors. We rode our bikes everywhere. The worst thing that ever happened was running out of gas on Route 67. Debbie's disappearance, it was like the air changed overnight. Suddenly, we weren't kids anymore. Suddenly, this place didn't feel safe. The last day. That Friday started like any other. Debbie left school at noon, stopped by Jack's service station to top off her parents' Chevy Impala, and chatted briefly with the young mechanic behind the counter, Tommy Whitaker. Tommy remembered her smiling politely, handing over a crumpled $5 bill. Thanks, Mr. Whitaker, she said softly. It was ordinary. Forgettable. But for investigators, it would later become a crucial thread. From there, Debbie met up with friends at Harlan's, where they lingered for a couple of hours. Around 9:15 p.m., she told them she needed to head home. Mom'll worry, she laughed. She walked out into the warm summer night, her sandals slapping softly against the pavement. The parking lot was full of familiar faces. Someone saw her wave to a passing car. Another swore she was headed down Maple Drive. Those were the last confirmed moments of her life. Why she mattered. When you talk to people who knew Debbie, you hear the same word over and over, light. She was light. Just this brightness in every room, Carolyn Brewer says, voice cracking. And when she disappeared, it was like someone flipped a switch. Debbie's death didn't just devastate her family, it fractured an entire town. Parents started locking doors and checking windows twice before bed. Kids who once roamed free were suddenly forbidden to walk home alone. Friendships strained as suspicion crept into conversations. The safety net of small-town Missouri had been ripped apart, leaving fear and unanswered questions in its place. But beneath the grief, beneath the sleepless nights and whispered prayers, there were threads. Threads no one saw at the time. Tommy Whitaker worked less than a mile from where Debbie disappeared. He knew her routines. Her family trusted him enough to let her stop at the station alone. And yet, in 1974, with limited forensic tools and no DNA testing, nothing tied him, or anyone, conclusively to her death. The case went cold. Debbie became a photograph in a box. Her family waited. And waited. And waited. 50 years later, when investigators reopened her case, they found her red sundress sealed inside an aging evidence bag. A single, nearly invisible clue, a trace of DNA beneath her fingernails, would finally pull the past into the present. And expose a truth darker than anyone imagined. Archival footage of 1970s Missouri plays, narrow gravel roads, quiet farmhouses, and flickering neon lights from small-town diners. A soft hum of cicadas fills the background as the narrator's voice fades in. Narrator, VO. To understand what happened to Debbie Kincaid that night in 1974, we need to step back into the days leading up to her disappearance. A time when nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until everything changed. Friday, September 13, 1974, 2 days before. It was a typical late summer afternoon in Jefferson County, Missouri. Debbie Kincaid, just 23 years old, had clocked out from her shift at the local garment factory around 5:30 p.m. She was known by co-workers as quiet but warm-hearted, always the first to help others and the last to complain. That evening, Debbie drove her light blue 1968 Chevy Nova down Route 21 heading to her parents' farmhouse about 15 minutes away. Her mother, Martha Kincaid, later told investigators. She said she was just gonna grab dinner with us and head back home. Nothing out of the ordinary. She seemed happy, normal. But unbeknownst to her family, Debbie's life had taken a stressful turn in the weeks leading up to her death. Debbie's secret struggles. Through interviews conducted decades later, detectives pieced together fragments of Debbie's private life. She had recently broken up with her longtime boyfriend, Gary Holt, a 27-year-old mechanic. Co-workers recalled that Gary had been possessive and got mean when he drank. Debbie had confided in her best friend, Lisa Morgan, that she'd been getting strange phone calls late at night. Lisa Morgan, interview clip. She told me she'd pick up the phone and no one would say anything. Just breathing. Debbie laughed it off, but I could tell it rattled her. Investigators now believe these calls were a crucial detail, a breadcrumb they missed in 1974. Saturday, September 14, 1974, the day before. The day before the crime, Debbie spent most of her afternoon running errands in Festus, a nearby small town. Store receipts recovered later showed she bought gasoline at Bill's Corner Station, $1.32. Groceries at Jensen's Market, bread, milk, and instant coffee. A paperback romance novel from Page Turner's bookshop. That evening, she was spotted at Rusty's Diner, sitting in a booth by the window. The waitress, Carol Trent, remembered seeing Debbie talking to a man she didn't recognize. Carol Trent, archival interview, 1974. She looked nervous. She kept stirring her coffee over and over. The guy she was with, dark hair, plaid shirt. He left first, and she just sat there a few minutes before paying her bill. Police never identified this man in 1974. Sunday, September 15, 1974, the day of the crime. 6:45 p.m., last seen alive. Debbie had dinner with her parents at their farmhouse. Around 6:30 p.m., she hugged her mother, waved goodbye, and got into her Chevy Nova. Her father, Harold Kincaid, later testified. She said she was heading home, maybe gonna call Lisa later. That was the last time I saw her. She never made it home. 7:10 p.m., witness number 1 sighting. A farmer named Earl Peterson told police he saw a blue Nova parked on a dirt pull-off near Old Mill Road, about halfway between Debbie's parents' home and her apartment. Earl Peterson. I thought it was odd, seeing a car sitting there with the lights off. I didn't see nobody inside, though. At the time, police dismissed this lead. But decades later, forensic mapping confirmed Earl's sighting was within 500 yards of where Debbie's body was eventually discovered. 7:25 p.m., the unknown caller. Phone records, unearthed only in 2023 during the cold case reinvestigation, showed that Debbie's landline received a call at 7:25 p.m. She never answered it. Cross-referencing surviving documents revealed the number belonged to Gary Holt's workplace. Gary, of course, denied making the call. 7:45 p.m., the disturbance. Residents near Big Creek Bridge reported hearing what sounded like a woman screaming, followed by a car door slamming. At least 2 911 calls came in that night, but with no patrol units nearby, it took officers over 45 minutes to respond. By then, the area was quiet. No car, no screams, no sign of a struggle. 8:15 p.m., the disappearance. When Debbie failed to answer her friend Lisa's calls that evening, Lisa assumed she was busy. But by the next morning, when Debbie missed her shift at the garment factory, Lisa knew something was wrong. The hours investigators missed. Decades later, detectives reviewing the case discovered several troubling lapses. No fingerprints were taken from Debbie's car when it was found abandoned. A smeared palm print on the driver's side window was photographed, but never analyzed. The strange phone calls Debbie had received weren't traced at the time, despite being reported. Detective Mark Hanley, 2024 interview. The first 48 hours were critical, and they blew it. Evidence that could have solved this case was either ignored or lost. In hindsight, investigators now believe Debbie knew her killer. The phone calls, the diner meeting, and the unidentified man near her car all point to someone she had been in contact with, possibly someone she trusted. And that night, under the fading light of a Missouri sunset, whatever confrontation took place on Old Mill Road escalated into tragedy. The camera slowly zooms in on a faded photograph of Debbie, smiling softly, her brown hair tucked behind her ears. Debbie Kincaid's disappearance shook this quiet community, but without solid evidence, the case quickly grew cold. For nearly 5 decades, her name became a whispered memory, until new technology unearthed secrets long thought buried. The morning after. October 13, 1974, Springfield, Missouri. The sun barely crept above the Ozark tree line when a low mist settled over the quiet outskirts of Springfield. The roads were damp from an early morning drizzle, the air heavy with the smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. At around 7:10 a.m., a local farmer named Harold Whitman, 58, was driving his battered 68 Chevy pickup along an isolated stretch of County Road 214, about 5 miles from Debbie Kincaid's apartment complex. Harold was on his way to check his cattle, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped thermos, when something caught his eye near a shallow drainage ditch. At first, he thought it was discarded laundry tangled in the tall grass. But then, as he slowed the truck, his stomach tightened. A pale arm was visible, motionless and half-covered by wet leaves. Harold slammed the truck into park, muttering under his breath, "Oh, Lord, please, no." Discovery. The ditch was muddy, slick beneath Harold's boots as he approached. The young woman lay on her side, partially concealed by weeds and autumn debris. Her long brown hair was plastered to her face by rainwater, and one of her shoes was missing. Harold didn't touch her. He knew better. He backed away slowly, hands shaking, and scrambled into his truck to radio the sheriff's department. "Harold, radioing, this is Whitman, out on County Road 214. I found someone. Looks like a girl. She's not moving. You better get out here." First responders arrive. By 7:45 a.m., Sheriff Paul Hensley and 2 deputies arrived on scene. They cordoned off the area, their boots sinking into the wet soil as they carefully approached the body. Debbie Kincaid, 23 years old, had been reported missing just 9 hours earlier by her roommate, Janice Miller. The moment Hensley saw the body, he feared the worst. Deputy Collins, whispering, "Sheriff, you think it's her?" Hensley, grimly, "Yeah. I reckon it is." Debbie's clothing was torn and damp, consistent with the light rain overnight, but what immediately drew attention were the marks around her wrists and neck. Faint rope abrasions suggested she'd been restrained at some point. Her purse was missing. Her apartment key was nowhere to be found. CSI work, 1974 limitations. The Missouri State Highway Patrol Crime Lab dispatched technicians to photograph and collect evidence. But in 1974, forensic science was rudimentary compared to today. There was no DNA profiling, no digital fingerprint databases. Investigators relied on physical clues. Tire tracks were discovered about 30 feet away, partially obscured by mud. A single button from what looked like a men's shirt was found snagged on a thorn bush near the ditch. A cigarette butt lay just a few feet from Debbie's body. No footprints, the early morning drizzle had washed most of them away. Despite the best efforts, investigators already feared this case would be an uphill battle. The identification. By 9:30 a.m., Janice Miller arrived at the scene, escorted by another deputy. She'd been Debbie's roommate for over 2 years and was the one who had reported her missing late last night. When she saw the blanket-covered stretcher being loaded into the coroner's van, Janice collapsed against the deputy's shoulder. Janice, sobbing, "That's her, that's Debbie." The sheriff didn't need an official ID. Janice confirmed what they already knew. The apartment sweep. By midday, investigators moved to Debbie's two-bedroom apartment off Cherry Street. The living room was tidy, a few art supplies stacked neatly by the window, sketchbooks half open. Debbie had been an aspiring illustrator who often spent nights drawing late into the morning. But last night, according to Janice, Debbie had been planning a quiet evening. Janice, she said she was going to grab a bite at Marty's diner around 8, maybe meet someone there, but she never came home. Inside Debbie's bedroom, her purse was missing, along with the jacket she'd worn the night before. On her desk was a crumpled napkin with a phone number scribbled in blue ink, a detail that would later haunt investigators. Autopsy findings. The preliminary autopsy conducted the following morning by Dr. Evelyn Rhodes, Greene County's medical examiner, revealed chilling details. Cause of death, manual strangulation. Time of death, likely between 10 p.m. and midnight on October 12. Evidence of a struggle, including bruising on her arms and wrists. Under Debbie's fingernails, trace skin cells, but in 1974, this evidence was useless without DNA testing. Dr. Rhodes noted something else unusual. Debbie's left earlobe was torn, suggesting an earring had been ripped out, but none were recovered at the scene. Immediate theories. By the afternoon of October 13, detectives began piecing together Debbie's final known movements. She left her apartment around 7:45 p.m. the night of October 12. Multiple witnesses saw her at Marty's diner between 8 o'clock and 8:45 p.m. A waitress recalled seeing Debbie talking to a man in his mid-20s at the counter, wearing a green army jacket. By 9:15 p.m., Debbie was last seen leaving the diner, alone. But nobody could identify the man in the army jacket. Media frenzy. By October 14, Springfield's small-town quiet was shattered. Local papers plastered Debbie's photo, a smiling young woman with soft brown curls and bright eyes, beneath headlines like, "Young woman found dead in county ditch. Strangulation suspected in 23-year-old's murder." Reporters crowded the sheriff's office, hungry for leads. Sheriff Hensley pleaded for patience. Hensley, to the press. "We're pursuing multiple leads and following up with everyone who may have seen Debbie that night. This is an active investigation." But behind closed doors, detectives were frustrated. Evidence was minimal, suspects were few, and forensics couldn't provide quick answers. A silent watcher. As night fell on October 14, investigators packed up for the day, frustrated and exhausted. Across town, on a quiet side street not far from Debbie's apartment, a man sat alone in his car, engine idling. His hands gripped the steering wheel tight, knuckles pale. In the passenger seat lay a single pearl earring. He glanced once at the rearview mirror, then disappeared into the night. The discovery of Debbie Kincaid's body on April 28, 1974, in a wooded clearing off Route 19 in rural Missouri sent shockwaves through the quiet community of Hartsville. For a town where doors were rarely locked and neighbors greeted each other by name, the brutal death of a 23-year-old nursing student was not just a tragedy, it was a violation of the town's sense of safety. As dawn broke over the rolling hills the morning after her body was found, the Hartsville Police Department scrambled into action. But the investigation that followed would expose small-town limitations, departmental missteps, and the chilling sense that the killer might be someone who blended seamlessly into the community. 1. Setting the stage, a scene frozen in time. Detective Raymond Ray Holloway, then a 34-year-old investigator with just 6 years on the force, was among the first called to the scene. Even decades later, he would recall the eerie stillness of that morning. The sun was just starting to rise, and the fog was clinging to the tree line. You could smell damp earth and honeysuckle. And then there she was, lying so unnaturally still. I knew right then this wasn't an accident. Debbie was found partially covered by leaves and branches, as if someone had tried, but not too hard, to conceal her body. Her blouse was torn, her jeans smeared with mud, and there were visible bruises along her arms and neck. There was no sign of her purse or jewelry. Investigators secured a 30-foot perimeter around the clearing, but with limited manpower, gaps in the cordon were obvious. By mid-morning, curious locals had gathered, some venturing dangerously close to potential evidence. "People don't realize back then we didn't have CSI protocols," Holloway later admitted. "We tried, but we were stretched thin. Honestly, half the town probably walked within 10 feet of that body before noon." 2. Collecting evidence, and missing some. The initial sweep turned up several critical items. Tire tracks leading from the highway down a narrow dirt path into the woods. A cigarette but partially buried near Debbie's body. 2 broken buttons from her blouse scattered nearby. However, forensic technology in 1974 was rudimentary. DNA analysis didn't exist yet, and fingerprint collection in outdoor environments was hit or miss. Investigators bagged the cigarette butt, photographed the tracks, and sketched the scene by hand. But not everything was handled properly. Heavy spring rains the night before washed away potential footprints, and investigators failed to cast molds of the tire tracks before they were trampled by officers and onlookers alike. Sheriff L. Whitaker, a gruff man nearing retirement, grew frustrated quickly. "Get me something I can use, Ray." "Anything," he barked. But the crime scene was stingy with its secrets. 3. Debbie's last known movements. Within 24 hours, detectives pieced together Debbie's final hours. Saturday, April 27, 1974, 7 p.m. Debbie left her apartment to meet friends at the Rusty Lantern, a local tavern popular with Hartsville's young crowd. 8:30 p.m. Multiple witnesses confirmed she was at the bar, laughing and sipping a single beer. She mentioned she planned to leave early to visit her parents in Springfield the next morning. 10:15 p.m. Bartender Linda Pruitt remembered Debbie settling her tab and stepping outside. 10:20 p.m. to 10:30 p.m. This 10-minute window became critical. Witnesses saw Debbie walking toward the gravel parking lot, but nobody saw her leave in her car, a green 1972 Ford Pinto. By dawn the next day, the Pinto was found parked at the far edge of the tavern's lot, locked. Her purse and keys were missing. 4. A town of suspects. With Debbie's timeline mapped, investigators turned their focus to potential suspects. A. The ex-boyfriend, Mark Sullivan. 26 years old, local mechanic. Dated Debbie for over a year before she ended things abruptly 2 months prior. Known to have a short temper. Claimed he hadn't seen her in weeks, but a waitress at the Rusty Lantern reported seeing him nursing a beer at the bar that night, just 2 tables away from Debbie. B. The stranger at the tavern. Several patrons recalled an unfamiliar man at the bar, mid-30s, tall, with a jagged scar across his jawline. Witnesses said he seemed fixated on Debbie, but no one knew his name. He vanished before police arrived the next morning. C. A darker possibility, the highway stalker. In the months leading up to Debbie's murder, 3 women in neighboring counties reported being followed late at night by a man in a dark pickup truck. Descriptions varied, but enough similarities existed to raise eyebrows. Detective Holloway kept an open mind but admitted privately. "Every lead we chased led to another dead end. It was like chasing smoke." 5. The autopsy report. On April 29, 1974, the autopsy was performed by Dr. Miriam Langston, the county medical examiner. Her findings deepened the mystery. Cause of death, strangulation. Time of death, between 10:45 p.m. and 11:30 p.m., roughly an hour after she was last seen alive. No defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting she may have been caught off guard. Traces of motor oil on her jeans, consistent with contact against a greasy vehicle or surface. Dr. Langston's conclusion was chilling. Whoever killed her knew what they were doing. This wasn't random chaos. It was deliberate. 6. A community on edge. By the first week of May, Hartsville transformed overnight. Parents warned daughters not to walk alone. The tavern installed extra lighting in its parking lot. Gun sales quietly spiked at Baker's Hardware. Local newspapers ran headlines like, "Nursing student slain, killer at large. Hartsville no longer safe." Rumors swirled. Some insisted it had to be an outsider passing through town. Others whispered it was someone they all knew, a neighbor, a co-worker, a friend. 7. A case going cold, even in the heat of summer. Despite interviews with over 80 witnesses, dozens of polygraph tests, and endless late-night stakeouts, by August 1974 the case had stalled. The cigarette but went untested for lack of technology. The scar-faced stranger was never identified. And Mark Sullivan, while suspicious, had an alibi that checked out, mostly. By year's end, the file was thinned out and moved to the back shelves of the Hartsville evidence room. Detective Holloway, frustrated and haunted, kept a personal box of case notes under his bed, a silent promise to Debbie that he wasn't giving up. "It never left me," he'd later say. "Every time I drove past Route 19, I thought about her. About what we missed." Debbie's parents, Harold and Judith Kincaid, held a small memorial in early May. Judith, her voice cracking through tears, told a local reporter, "All we want is answers. Whoever did this, they're still out there, walking free." It would be nearly 5 decades before that answer finally came, and when it did, the truth was darker than anyone imagined. The weeks following Debbie Kincaid's murder blurred into a relentless storm of tips, interrogations, and dashed hopes. For the small town of Willow Springs, Missouri, the tragedy had been like an open wound, raw, unhealed, and impossible to ignore. But as spring gave way to summer, then summer to fall, the Kincaid case grew colder with each passing week. 1. Promising leads that went nowhere. Detective Harold Hal Morrison sat in his cluttered office at the Howell County Sheriff's Department, drowning in paperwork. A stale cup of coffee steamed faintly on his desk. The crime scene photos of Debbie, the vibrant 23-year-old whose life had been so brutally ended, stared back at him from a folder he couldn't bring himself to close. In the first few weeks after the discovery of her body, the phones at the department rang non-stop. A trucker claimed he'd seen a young brunette hitchhiking near US Route 60 the night she vanished. A local gas station attendant insisted he'd spotted Debbie's green Ford Maverick parked behind an abandoned barn. A waitress swore she overheard two men talking about a girl they took care of at a roadside diner. Hal followed up on every single lead. "I spent more time in my cruiser than at home," Hal would later recall in a 1999 interview. "We tore through every field, barn, and creek bed within 50 miles. Every time we thought we had something, it slipped through our fingers." The Maverick was never found. The young brunette turned out to be a college student passing through. The overheard conversation? Two drunk farmhands talking about an unrelated bar fight. Each disappointment chipped away at the investigators' resolve, and the Kincaid family's hope. 2. The Kincaid family fractures. For Debbie's parents, Walter and Marie Kincaid, the pain was relentless. Walter, once known for his easy laugh and steady hands, stopped going into town altogether. His small auto repair shop, the pride of his livelihood, sat dark most days. Customers eventually stopped calling. Marie, meanwhile, became a ghost of herself. She spent hours sitting in Debbie's bedroom, carefully folding and refolding the same sweaters, smoothing the same quilt Debbie's grandmother had made. She avoided mirrors, avoided neighbors, avoided living. Debbie's younger brother, Tommy, only 17 at the time, lashed out in anger. He punched holes in walls, got into fights at school, and turned away from his parents, blaming them, unfairly, for not protecting his sister. The Kincaids stopped hosting Sunday dinners. Stopped attending church. Stopped opening their mail. "It's like Debbie died, and then we all died in pieces afterward," Tommy told a reporter in 1988. Just slower. 3. The suspects who slipped away. Within weeks, authorities identified 3 potential suspects. None stuck. A. The jealous ex-boyfriend. Debbie had recently ended things with Mark Rivers, a local carpenter known for his temper. Mark denied involvement, saying he still loved her. He admitted they'd argued the week before she vanished, but he had an alibi, drinking with co-workers at a bowling alley all night. Every co-worker backed him up. Mark was cleared. B. The drifter. Witnesses reported seeing a shabby-looking man wandering near the wooded area where Debbie's body was found. Locals suspected he might be a transient who camped near the railroad tracks. The man was eventually tracked down. His name was Henry Pike, a Vietnam vet living out of his truck. After hours of questioning, nothing tied him to the murder. C. The unknown stranger. Several young women in the area reported being followed by a man in a dark blue Chevy Nova weeks before Debbie's disappearance. Investigators searched for the car exhaustively but never found it, or its driver. "It was like chasing shadows," Hal Morrison said. "Every suspect turned into smoke the closer we got." 4. The toll on the town. By late 1974, Willow Springs no longer felt like the same town. Parents stopped letting their daughters walk home alone. Store owners installed locks on back doors that had been open for decades. Teenagers whispered stories about the killer who walks among us. The sheriff's department held community meetings to reassure residents, but fear had already taken root. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some believed a serial killer was passing through Missouri. Others suspected the murder was connected to a satanic cult rumored to be operating in the Ozarks. A few whispered that someone within the sheriff's department knew more than they were letting on. The Kincaid case became the town's obsession, its unspoken curse. 5. Investigators burning out. By the time 1975 rolled around, resources were running thin. The Howell County Sheriff's Department had only 8 deputies and 1 overworked detective, Hal. "We were chasing ghosts without the tools to fight them," Hal later admitted. "We didn't have DNA, we didn't have databases, we didn't even have a decent budget for lab tests." Evidence collected at the scene, fibers, a cigarette butt, partial footprints, sat locked in a box, waiting for a future where technology might make sense of them. For Hal, Each passing year felt like a personal failure. He kept Debbie's photo pinned to his office corkboard, even as new cases piled up. 6 decades of silence. As the years turned into decades, hope dimmed further. By the 1980s, the Kincaids stopped returning reporters' calls. In 1991, Walter Kincaid died of a heart attack, never knowing what happened to his daughter. Marie moved away, living quietly under her maiden name, avoiding any mention of Willow Springs. Tommy left Missouri altogether, eventually settling in Arkansas, where he raised a family of his own. The case file collected dust in a backroom drawer. It became a cold case statistic, remembered only by the family and a few aging detectives. 7. A haunting persistence. Yet, even in its coldest years, Debbie's case wasn't forgotten. Hal Morrison, retired by the early 2000s, still carried her memory. He'd drive past the wooded area off Highway 181 and feel the same churn in his gut he felt in 1974. It's not the kind of thing you let go of, Hal told a true crime author in 2007. Every time I hear about new forensic tech, I wonder if it could finally give Debbie back her voice. Little did he know, advances in DNA testing would eventually blow the case wide open. But in the 1970s, that was decades away. For now, all they had were ghosts. A promise in the dark. The Kincaid case was a wound that time refused to heal. Families fractured. Investigators burned out. An entire community learned to live with fear and unanswered questions. But tucked away in a cardboard evidence box, under decades of dust, were the tiny, silent witnesses, fibers, prints, and a cigarette butt, waiting for a future where someone, somewhere, would listen. The murder of Debbie Kincaid, just 23 years old, didn't just leave her family shattered, it left an entire small Missouri town haunted. Over the years, as the investigation stalled and no arrests were made, fact blurred into folklore. The lack of answers created a vacuum, and the community filled it with rumors, whispers, and eerie tales that gave Debbie's case a life of its own. A town that couldn't let go. By the early 1980s, 6 years after Debbie's death, the shock had faded into something heavier, a quiet, enduring dread. Everyone knew her name. Parents used it as a cautionary tale for their children. Debbie Kincaid wasn't just a pretty young woman who had been murdered, she had become a symbol of vulnerability in a place where people once thought they were safe. At first, the legends were simple, stories whispered at kitchen tables and over diner counters. You know, they say Debbie was last seen hitchhiking home that night. No, I heard she had a boyfriend nobody knew about. Maybe he did it. I heard she saw something she wasn't supposed to see, and someone made sure she stayed quiet. The lack of official answers allowed these theories to grow roots. The Highway 47 killer. One of the earliest and most persistent myths was that Debbie had fallen victim to a serial predator. Locals began connecting her murder to other unsolved cases along Highway 47, a lonely stretch of road between Jefferson City and smaller rural towns where travelers often disappeared. Truckers would swap stories at rest stops. That girl, Debbie, wasn't the only one. You ask me, there's a guy out there, still driving that route, picking them off one by one. By the mid-1980s, parents began warning their daughters never to walk alone after dark and certainly never to accept rides from strangers. 4 young women in the county, Debbie's name became shorthand for danger. But the Highway 47 killer theory was never backed by evidence. Still, every new disappearance within a 50-mile radius, no matter how unrelated, was tied back to her in the minds of locals. The Lover's Lane rumor. Then came the whispers about Lover's Lane, a secluded ridge overlooking the river where teenagers would park their cars on summer nights. Some said Debbie had been there the night she died. Others claimed they'd heard that the killer still prowled the area, hunting for new victims. Over the years, the ridge became a dare among high schoolers. Spend one night at Lover's Lane, and you'll hear Debbie scream. It became a kind of rite of passage, fueled by fear and morbid fascination. Flashlights clicked on, beer cans cracked open, and nervous laughter filled the darkness as teens dared each other to walk the dirt path alone where they believed Debbie's spirit lingered. The ghost in the woods. By the 1990s, Debbie's story had transformed into something supernatural. Several hunters claimed to have seen a woman in a blood-stained dress wandering the woods near where her body had been found. One man swore she appeared right in front of his deer stand at dawn, staring silently before vanishing without a sound. Another told the local paper, "I ain't saying I believe in ghosts, but I know what I saw, and I know it was her." Even people who didn't buy into ghost stories admitted that the woods where Debbie's body was discovered felt different. As if the air was heavier. As if the silence itself carried secrets. False confessions and local suspects. In a community desperate for closure, rumors didn't just stay whispers, sometimes they destroyed lives. A young mechanic who'd once fixed Debbie's car was nearly run out of town after someone claimed he acted strange when police questioned him. A drifter who'd passed through the area weeks before her death was arrested twice on suspicion but released each time for lack of evidence. Even Debbie's ex-boyfriend, Tommy Rhodes, wasn't spared. He spent years under a cloud of suspicion, losing jobs and friendships, despite never being charged. The rumors didn't solve the case, they only fractured the community further. How the myths kept Debbie alive. For Debbie's family, these legends were both a curse and a strange comfort. Her younger sister, Carla, once told a reporter in the early 2000s. "It's like she became this ghost story people tell to scare their kids, but at least it means they haven't forgotten her." For Carla, every urban myth, no matter how far-fetched, was proof that her sister's story still mattered. But it also meant living in the shadow of the unknown. When silence becomes dangerous. These myths had a darker effect too. As years passed, people stopped talking to the police and started trusting rumors more than facts. Investigators from the 1990s Cold Case Unit later admitted they were chasing false leads for years, wasting time on urban legends while key evidence degraded in storage. Debbie's case became less about what happened and more about what people believed happened. The folklore that shaped a town. By the 2010s, new generations had grown up hearing Debbie's name without really knowing her story. Kids would whisper it during sleepovers. Teens would dare each other to walk through the woods after dark. Local businesses even sold Debbie's Last Ride t-shirts during a short-lived tourist push, much to her family's outrage. Debbie Kincaid had become a folk tale, a warning, a ghost. But beneath the myths, the real Debbie, a 23-year-old with dreams, a family, and a future, was slowly disappearing. The truth waiting in the shadows. All the stories, the urban myths, the whispers around diner booths, none of them were close to the truth. The real killer had been right there all along. And in 2022, a breakthrough in DNA technology would finally cut through decades of rumor and legend, bringing hard facts where there had only been fear. For the first time in almost 50 years, the Kincaid family would learn what really happened that night. The spring of 2022 brought an unexpected shift to the quiet town of Maple Hollow, Maine. For nearly 4 decades, the murder of Debbie Kincaid had remained buried beneath layers of silence, faded memories, and unanswered questions. Locals had learned to live with the unsolved tragedy like an old scar, painful, but numb with time. Families avoided talking about it. Police had long filed the evidence away in a dust-covered cabinet, and many who once pounded the pavement for answers had either moved away or passed on. But sometimes, old ghosts don't stay buried forever. A box, a basement, and a spark. It began on an unusually warm April morning. Detective Laura Kinney, 42, wasn't even assigned to the Kincaid case. She had grown up in Maple Hollow, though, and Debbie's name was one she'd heard whispered in her own childhood home. On her days off, she liked combing through unsolved files as a personal hobby, a ritual she described as tidying up loose ends. That morning, she requested access to the cold case archives, tucked away in the basement of the Knox County Sheriff's Department. Among stacks of water-stained cardboard boxes, she found case file #84-116, labeled Kincaid, Deborah N., Homicide, 1984. Inside, the original crime scene photographs, autopsy report, and witness statements were stacked in neat piles. But something strange caught her attention, a sealed paper envelope marked unprocessed evidence. Inside were several items collected from the crime scene but never analyzed. Debbie's cream-colored sweater, stained and torn at the collar. A cigarette but found near the clearing where her body had been discovered. A lock of Debbie's hair snagged on a branch nearby. In 1984, DNA analysis was still in its infancy. By today's standards, the department had been sitting on a potential gold mine. Laura hesitated. Cases this cold had a way of resisting new life. Still, something in her gut whispered, run the tests. A town frozen in time. While Laura quietly reopened the case, Maple Hollow was beginning to stir. The upcoming Founders Day festival meant tourists would soon flood the town square, and locals were already setting up booths and banners. On the surface, it was business as usual. But beneath the polite smiles and small talk, Debbie's case was still an unhealed wound. At the Maple Hollow Diner, where Debbie once worked weekends during college, her picture still hung on the wall, a smiling 23-year-old with feathered brown hair and a soft denim jacket. Regulars noticed Laura studying it that week and whispered among themselves. "Why is she poking around that old mess?" asked Edna Brewer, 68, a waitress who had served Debbie countless cups of coffee. "Best leave the dead to rest." But not everyone agreed. Janice Miller, Debbie's childhood friend, leaned across her booth and whispered, "If there's even a chance they can find who did it, they have to try." For families like the Kincaids, this wasn't history, it was a living grief. The Kincaids' reluctant hope. When Laura called Helen Kincaid, Debbie's mother, her voice trembled as she introduced herself. "Mrs. Kincaid, my name's Detective Laura McKinney. I wanted to let you know we've decided to submit some evidence from Debbie's case for new forensic testing." There was a long silence. Then, Helen, now 78 years old, spoke softly. I stopped praying for answers years ago. It hurt too much. But if you think you can finally find out who." She trailed off, her voice breaking. Helen had outlived her husband, who died in 2005, and her son, who passed from cancer in 2017. Debbie's case was the last thread tying her to decades of pain. She agreed to cooperate but warned Laura not to raise false hopes. Science breathes life into the past. The evidence was sent to the Maine State Crime Lab. Within weeks, new DNA profiles were extracted from a partial fingerprint on Debbie's sweater. A hair follicle recovered from the scene. The cigarette butt. The lab uploaded the DNA into CODIS, the national database. For weeks, nothing happened. Then, on July 9, 2022, Laura got the call she had almost stopped expecting. "Detective McKinney? We've got a hit." The DNA on the cigarette matched a second cousin living in Vermont, found through genetic genealogy, a breakthrough technique that had cracked dozens of cold cases nationwide. The name no one expected. As Laura followed the genealogy trail, the name that surfaced shocked her. Robert Bobby Jennings. Back in 1984, Bobby had been 24 years old, a Maple Hollow native, former high school football star, and the son of a respected church deacon. At the time, he told investigators he barely knew Debbie, offering a vague alibi that was never fully corroborated. Without evidence, police hadn't pursued him further. Now, in 2022, Bobby Jennings was 62 and living in New Hampshire, working part-time at a hardware store. The town reacts. When whispers of a possible break leaked, Maple Hollow buzzed with speculation. Old wounds reopened overnight. At Carter's General Store, locals gathered around the register, arguing in hushed tones. "Bobby Jennings? No way. He was a good kid," muttered one man. "Good kids don't leave dead girls in the woods," another snapped back. Helen Kincaid, upon hearing the name, reportedly sat silently for nearly an hour before saying, "I always thought it was someone from out of town. Someone passing through. I never imagined it could have been one of our own." A new kind of war. Laura now faced a battle on two fronts. The investigation, which had to move carefully to build a rock-solid case after decades of inactivity. The community backlash, where loyalty, denial, and decades-old alliances threatened to derail progress. Some locals accused her of digging up ghosts for attention. Others rallied behind her, demanding long-overdue justice. Through it all, Laura kept her focus on Debbie. The catalyst reaches its peak. On August 3, 2022, forensic genealogists confirmed Bobby Jennings as the primary suspect. A search warrant was issued for his New Hampshire residence. Inside, investigators recovered a stash of old photographs, including several candid shots of Debbie taken without her knowledge. A handwritten journal describing a night in the woods that eerily matched the timeline of her disappearance. A hunting knife engraved with Bobby's initials. Suddenly, the case wasn't a whisper anymore, it was a storm. National media descended on Maple Hollow, reopening wounds the town had spent 38 years trying to forget. For Helen, the moment was bittersweet. "I prayed for answers, and now I have them. But it doesn't bring my baby back." A town forever changed. The catalyst wasn't just about solving Debbie's murder, it fractured the illusion of safety that Maple Hollow had clung to for decades. Friends questioned friends. Families turned on each other. And every time someone passed the wooded clearing where Debbie's body was found, they remembered that evil had always been closer than they thought. For Laura, it was personal now. Debbie's case wasn't just reopened, it was alive. And she wasn't stopping until every shadow, every secret, every unanswered question saw the light of day. Because, for the first time in 38 years, Maple Hollow was finally ready to face the truth. The morning of October 18, 2019 began like any other in the sleepy town of Eagle's Nest, Maine. A soft mist rolled off the Penobscot River, blanketing the pine-draped hills in a pale haze. At the edge of town, the Kennebec County Sheriff's Office was already humming with the usual activity, reports of deer strikes, property disputes, and the occasional break-in. But deep inside the archives, beneath flickering fluorescent lights and the musty scent of old paper, a discovery was about to shift the balance of a 23-year-old cold case. A box in the dark. Detective Caroline Briggs, a seasoned investigator with a sharp, no-nonsense edge, crouched on the floor of the evidence room, surrounded by towering shelves of forgotten history. 4 weeks, she'd been tasked with assisting the department's cold case initiative, a statewide effort launched in 2018 after Maine allocated funds to revisit unresolved homicides using modern forensic tools. One of the first files on her list, Debbie Kincaid, age 23. Briggs carefully slit open the battered cardboard box labeled Kincaid, D. 1996. Inside lay a time capsule, faded Polaroids from the crime scene, scribbled notes from the original detectives, and meticulously bagged evidence. Among the items was a torn fragment of Debbie's blouse, sealed in plastic. Back in 1996, testing methods were limited. Analysts had concluded there wasn't enough material to yield usable DNA. But 2019 was a different story. Briggs stared at the swatch, her fingers tightening around the bag. "We've got better tools now," she whispered, as if speaking directly to Debbie. "Old wounds, new tools." Later that afternoon, Briggs presented her findings to Captain Mark Ellsworth, the gruff, gray-haired veteran who'd overseen the original investigation. "Briggs, sir, there's potential DNA evidence here. With modern STR analysis, we could extract a profile even from a degraded sample." Ellsworth, pausing, rubbing his temple. "Caroline, we chased every lead back then. We ran out of road." "Briggs, then it's time to build a new one." Ellsworth studied her, torn between skepticism and hope. He still carried the sting of the original failure. Debbie's murder had haunted him for decades. After a moment, he nodded. "All right," he said. "Send it to the lab." The families react. Word of the reopened case reached Linda Kincaid, Debbie's mother, 2 days later. By now, Linda was in her late 60s, her once dark hair a soft crown of silver. She lived alone in the small ranch house where Debbie had grown up, the walls still lined with photos of a daughter frozen in time, smiling, young, and vibrant. When Briggs knocked on her door, Linda's first instinct was caution. "You're here about Debbie, aren't you?" she asked, her voice trembling before Briggs could even introduce herself. Briggs nodded gently. "We're revisiting the investigation, Mrs. Kincaid. We're running new tests that weren't available before." Linda's hands flew to her mouth, eyes shining with tears she thought had long dried. "Linda, I prayed for this, for years. I thought everyone forgot about her." "Briggs, we haven't forgotten. And we won't stop until we know the truth." The news spread quickly through Eagle's Nest. Neighbors stopped Linda in grocery aisles. Old classmates of Debbie's reached out on Facebook. The quiet reopening of a cold case had stirred something buried deep within the community, a collective yearning for closure. Reconstructing 1996. As the lab processed the blouse fragment, Briggs and her team returned to the original investigation timeline, piecing together every detail from that fateful spring night in May 1996. Debbie had been last seen leaving her shift at the Wharf Cafe, where she worked evenings as a waitress. Co-workers remembered her laughing as she locked up around 10:45 p.m. Witness statements placed her car leaving the cafe parking lot, headed toward her apartment on Riverbend Lane. She never made it home. Her 1992 Honda Civic was found 3 days later on an abandoned logging road outside town, its driver's side door ajar. Debbie's purse, wallet, and shoes were missing. "We assumed robbery at first," Ellsworth explained to Briggs during a late-night review session. But nothing in her bank records matched. No stolen credit card activity. No sign she ran away. They had suspects, too. Eddie Rollins, Debbie's ex-boyfriend, who had a documented history of jealousy and once smashed her car window during an argument. Gary Holt, a co-worker with an inappropriate fixation on her. And a few unnamed drifters passing through town that spring, one of whom was reportedly seen lurking near the Wharf Cafe. All were questioned. None were charged. The breakthrough. By December 2019, nearly 2 months after the blouse fragment had been submitted, the Maine State Crime Lab called back with results that sent a ripple of electricity through the department. "Caroline," the lab technician said over the phone, "we got a full male DNA profile off the fabric. STR amplification worked better than expected." Briggs nearly dropped her coffee. "You're kidding." "No," the tech replied. "And it's not in CODIS. Whoever this is, he's not in the system." The news was bittersweet. They had a profile but no match. To Briggs, though, this wasn't a setback, it was a new beginning. Old suspects, fresh scrutiny. Briggs revisited the original suspects, this time armed with DNA swabs and sharper tools. Eddie Rollins now worked at a fishing supply store in Bangor. He'd long since remarried, his anger issues reportedly behind him. He agreed to provide a swab but scoffed at the idea he was still a suspect. Gary Holt, the creepy co-worker, was harder to track down. After a string of DUIs and short stints in jail, he'd moved south to New Hampshire. Briggs drove 3 hours to collect his DNA. The unnamed drifters? Dead ends. No records, no names, just rumors from 1996. Weeks later, the lab reported back, no matches. Reconstructing the scene. Frustrated but undeterred, Briggs turned to geoforensic analysis, overlaying 1996 topographical maps with current satellite imagery. With the help of crime analyst Zoe Patel, they examined the abandoned logging road where Debbie's car had been found, comparing soil samples and vegetation records. Zoe's findings stunned Briggs. Back in '96, that road wasn't completely abandoned. There was active logging just a mile away, Zoe said, tapping at a digital map. Truck drivers came through here regularly. Most were from out of state. A new theory began to take shape. Debbie's killer might have been someone transient, a face passing through Eagle's Nest who vanished just as quickly. The database gamble. In early 2020, Briggs pushed for something controversial, genetic genealogy. Using the extracted DNA, she proposed uploading the profile to GEDmatch, a database used by amateur genealogists and increasingly by law enforcement to track suspects through distant relatives. Ellsworth hesitated. That's a legal minefield, Caroline. You know the debates around privacy. Briggs countered, it's our best shot. Debbie deserves this. After weeks of legal wrangling and signed authorizations, the DNA was uploaded. Within 72 hours, they got a hit, not a direct match, but a third cousin in rural Vermont. A name emerges. Building out a genetic family tree, Briggs and Zoe traced connections backward and sideways, eliminating branches one by one. By June 2020, a name crystallized at the center, Thomas "Tommy" Granger, a long-haul truck driver who had worked seasonal contracts in Maine during the mid-90s. Granger's background was chilling. Arrested twice for assault in 1994 and 1998. Fired from 3 trucking companies for behavioral issues. Lived in a trailer park outside Augusta during the spring of 1996, just 15 miles from Eagle's Nest. When Briggs looked at his photo from a 2001 DUI arrest, a shiver ran down her spine. This is him, she whispered. I know it. Setting the trap. Granger was now 52 years old and living in Claremont, New Hampshire. Briggs coordinated with local law enforcement to discreetly collect his DNA from a discarded coffee cup. 3 weeks later, the lab confirmed it. The DNA from Debbie's blouse matched Tommy Granger's profile perfectly. Closing the circle. When Linda Kincaid received the call, she sat silently for a long time, clutching the phone to her chest. Linda, I always knew. I just didn't know who. Thank you. The reopening of Debbie's case didn't just give the Kincaid family answers, it ignited something larger. For the first time in decades, Eagle's Nest felt closer to healing. But the hardest part was still ahead, bringing Granger to justice. Foreshadowing the arrest. As Briggs prepared the arrest warrant, one thought consumed her. This wasn't just about Debbie anymore. Tommy Granger had been a long-haul driver for decades. He'd crossed multiple states. If he'd killed once, had he killed before? The reopened investigation had finally cracked open a door Eagle's Nest thought was sealed forever, but what lay beyond it might be darker than anyone imagined. The last winter leaves of January 2023 clung stubbornly to the skeletal maples surrounding Ravenwood County, their brittle edges whispering with each gust of icy wind. Inside the Ravenwood Sheriff's Department, however, the atmosphere was anything but cold. After 43 years of unanswered questions, after decades of silence, the Debbie Kincaid case, a haunting, open wound in the town's history, was finally beginning to bleed revelations. Detective Elena Marlowe, now leading the newly reopened cold case task force, sat hunched over her desk, the faint hum of an overhead fluorescent light buzzing above her. Spread out before her were stacks of evidence files, some yellowed and frayed with age, others crisp and newly printed. Beside them sat a sleek tablet connected to a state-of-the-art DNA database. Tell me you've got something, muttered Deputy Chris Hall, leaning against the doorway with a steaming mug of coffee. Elena looked up, eyes rimmed red from exhaustion but burning with purpose. We've got more than something, she said quietly, tapping on her tablet. The genealogy results are in. And they just gave us a family tree. The breakthrough. Months earlier, during the Catalyst event, Debbie Kincaid's preserved blouse, sealed for over 4 decades in an evidence locker, had been sent for advanced touch DNA analysis. Technology had evolved since 1980, when investigators had little more than fingerprints and intuition. Now, a microscopic sample could unravel entire bloodlines. The results pointed to familial matches within a regional genetic database. One name kept recurring among multiple relatives: Frank Bowers, a 68-year-old former Ravenwood resident now living 2 towns over in a modest ranch-style home. Frank had been on the periphery of the original investigation in 1980. A quiet, blue-collar mechanic who frequented the Rusty Spur Tavern, the same bar where Debbie was last seen, he was questioned briefly but dismissed. He had no criminal record, no apparent motive, and a solid alibi, vouched for by his then-girlfriend. But the DNA evidence was unrelenting. Frank wasn't just connected. He was directly linked. Reconstructing Frank's past. Detective Marlowe ordered her team to quietly rebuild Frank Bowers' life, every job, every relationship, every unexplained gap. They discovered unsettling patterns. 1980, he worked at Ravenwood Auto Repair, 2 blocks from where Debbie's car was last parked. 1981 to 1983, Frank moved briefly to Dayton, Ohio, following a short-lived engagement. During that period, an unsolved assault case bore eerie similarities to Debbie's. 1986, he returned to Ravenwood, living in near isolation on the edge of town. Neighbors described him as friendly enough but odd. 1992, arrested for trespassing on private farmland at night but released without charges. 2015, his wife died suddenly. Coroner ruled it natural causes, but whispers suggested otherwise. The deeper they dug, the more Elena's instincts screamed that Frank had lived his entire adult life hiding in plain sight. Interviewing old witnesses. Before making any move, Marlowe and her team revisited witnesses from Debbie's final night. At the Rusty Spur Tavern, now a faded shadow of its former self, they met Eleanor Briggs, the bartender on duty the night Debbie vanished. Her hands trembled slightly as she lit a cigarette, her gaze distant. "I remember her," Eleanor said softly. "Pretty girl. Laugh that could cut through a storm. She wasn't from around here, though. People noticed." "Do you remember Frank Bowers?" Elena asked, sliding an old photo across the counter. Eleanor stared at it for a long beat, then exhaled smoke slowly. "Yeah, he was there. Sat in the corner booth like always, tinkering with his lighter. Didn't say much to anyone. But," she hesitated, her voice lowering. "Now that you mention it, I think he was watching her. Following her with his eyes." This wasn't in any 1980 interview transcript. Either Eleanor hadn't mentioned it, or detectives had overlooked it. Another witness, Gary Monroe, Debbie's old co-worker, recalled something equally chilling. "She left the bar around 11, Gary said. Said she was headed back to her cousin's place. I offered to walk her, but she waved me off." He paused, frowning. "I saw Frank standing by the alley when she left. Didn't think much of it back then, but now." Each testimony laid suspicion thicker. Surveillance and strategy. Armed with the DNA match and renewed eyewitness accounts, Elena initiated surveillance on Frank Bowers. 2 unmarked cars rotated shifts, parked discreetly down his quiet cul-de-sac. Drones monitored from above when necessary, and plainclothes officers blended into nearby diners and hardware stores. Frank's life, from the outside, seemed mundane. Morning coffee at Harrison's diner. Afternoon tinkering in his garage. Evenings spent alone, occasionally fishing by the old quarry. But there were anomalies. Twice, detectives watched him drive late at night to Maple Creek Woods, less than a mile from where Debbie's body had been found in 1980. Why go back there after 43 years? Hall whispered one night, binoculars pressed to his face. "Because some ghosts," Elena murmured, "never stay buried." Confrontation looms. Before moving in, Elena needed airtight probable cause. They secured a warrant for Frank's discarded items: coffee cups, cigarette butts, anything that could yield a secondary DNA sample to confirm the match. When the lab results came back, there was no longer room for doubt. The DNA recovered from Debbie's blouse in 1980 belonged to Frank Bowers. Still, Elena hesitated. This wasn't just about science, this was about justice, decades overdue. She needed his psychology cracked, his guilt laid bare. She requested the assistance of Dr. Malcolm Reed, a forensic psychologist specializing in cold cases. Together, they built a profile. Frank exhibited compulsive revisitation behavior, explaining his trips to Maple Creek. His isolation and obsessive tendencies aligned with offender patterns. He likely saw Debbie as a symbol, not just a victim, someone who represented something unattainable. Push on regret, Dr. Reed advised. Men like him, they are haunted even if they don't show it. The tipping point. On March 17, 2023, as dawn broke over Ravenwood, Elena and her team assembled outside Frank's home. They weren't there to arrest him, not yet. First, they wanted a voluntary interview. Frank opened the door, older but broad-shouldered, his gray hair cropped close, his piercing blue eyes still sharp. "You cops never give up, huh?" he said with a dry chuckle, leaning against the frame. Elena smiled faintly. Some things shouldn't be given up on. Inside, the house was meticulously clean, almost sterile. Frank sat opposite her at the kitchen table, fingers drumming slowly against the wood. "We're revisiting Debbie Kincaid's case," Elena began. "You remember her?" Frank's jaw flexed. "I remember the whole damn town losing its mind over it. We've made some advancements. Technology, witnesses, records." She let the words hang. "We know you were there that night, Frank." Silence. A muscle in his temple twitched. "We have your DNA," she continued softly. "On her clothing." Frank laughed, a low, humorless sound. "After 40 years, and you're sure it's mine? That's rich." Elena leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "We're sure. And I think you've been carrying this weight longer than you want to admit." For the first time, Frank looked rattled. He opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, jaw clenching hard. His hands, once steady, began to tremble faintly. Setting the trap. Frank didn't confess, not yet. But Elena knew the walls were closing in. Surveillance intensified. Every movement catalogued, every call monitored. A week later, detectives recovered a lockbox buried beneath loose boards in Frank's garage. Inside were newspaper clippings about Debbie's disappearance, her high school yearbook photo, and, most damning of all, a gold locket engraved with DK. When confronted with the evidence, Frank's facade began to crack. "You don't understand," he whispered, voice barely audible. She laughed at me." Elena held her breath, sensing the shift. "Frank, help us understand. Tell us what happened that night." He stared at his hands, eyes glassy, trapped between denial and confession. By the end of March 2023, the case against Frank Bowers was nearly unbreakable. The DNA, the locket, the witness statements, his late-night trips to the crime scene. For the first time since June 14, 1980, Ravenwood stood on the brink of justice. But Elena knew better than to celebrate. Confession or not, the next step would decide everything. The night of August 12, 2023, broke differently in Meadowbrook. For nearly 4 decades, the Debbie Kincaid case had haunted this small Appalachian town like a restless spirit. The whispers of her name clung to the edges of conversations, hovering like smoke that never quite cleared. But on this warm, humid summer night, the decades-long silence cracked open, and for the first time since March 3, 1983, Debbie's family, her friends, and an entire community would finally learn who took her life. A knock at midnight. At 11:47 p.m., a convoy of unmarked cars rolled quietly into a cul-de-sac on the south side of Meadowbrook. Inside one of the houses, a modest, weather-worn split-level ranch with faded green shutters, lived Robert "Bobby" Creighton, now 67 years old. He was once the town's golden boy, captain of the high school football team, local mechanic, and, for a time, Debbie's on-again, off-again boyfriend in the early 80s. But the years hadn't been kind to him. His once broad shoulders had rounded, his hair had gone thin and gray, and his sharp blue eyes had dulled to something weary, almost haunted. It had taken DNA evidence, analyzed through genealogical databases, to connect Bobby to the scene, a small blood sample found on Debbie's blouse that had lain frozen for nearly 40 years. Investigators had spent months quietly building the case, monitoring his movements, digging through old witness statements, and re-interviewing anyone who might still remember that night. Now, they were ready. "Unit 3, move in," came the whispered command over the radio. 4 officers approached the front door while 2 circled to the back. Inside, Bobby sat in his recliner, beer in hand, watching a late-night baseball game. When the knock came, he didn't seem surprised, not exactly scared, either. "Mr. Creighton," Detective Marla Jennings called through the door, her voice steady, "we have a warrant for your arrest in connection to the 1983 homicide of Debbie Kincaid." "Open the door." There was a pause, 5 long seconds where the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the latch clicked. Bobby opened the door slowly, hands raised. "You finally figured it out, huh?" he said, almost softly. "Took you long enough." The interrogation room. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in Interview Room 2 at the Meadowbrook County Sheriff's Office. Bobby sat slouched in a metal chair, wrists cuffed to a steel ring on the table. A half-empty bottle of water rested untouched in front of him. Across from him sat Detective Jennings and FBI Special Agent Caleb Monroe, who had been assigned to assist when the case was reopened. At first, Bobby said nothing. He asked for a cigarette, which Jennings denied, and then spent several minutes staring at the blank wall behind her, his jaw working silently. Finally, Monroe leaned forward. "Bobby," he said quietly, "the science doesn't lie. We matched your DNA to evidence from Debbie's body. We know you were with her that night. The question now is whether this was an accident, or something worse." Bobby chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "You want to know what happened?" he rasped, his voice low and uneven. "Fine. I'll tell you." The confession. According to Bobby, the events of March 3, 1983, started innocently enough. He and Debbie had been fighting for weeks over their on-again, off-again relationship. She'd started seeing someone new, a local college kid from Charleston, and Bobby, still carrying a torch for her, hadn't taken it well. "She called me that night," he said, rubbing his wrists absently where the cuffs dug into his skin. "Said she wanted to talk. Said we should meet down by the quarry." The quarry. That same abandoned pit where kids drank, smoked, and carved their names into sandstone walls. Where police had found Debbie's car half buried under pine needles. "When I got there," Bobby continued, "she was already upset. She said she was done with me. Done with the fighting. Done with us." He paused, his breathing uneven. "I lost it. I didn't mean to, I swear to God, I didn't mean to. I grabbed her arm. She screamed. I pushed her. She fell, hit her head on one of the rocks. And then she just stopped moving." Silence filled the room, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. Detective Jennings leaned in. "You left her there, Bobby. Alone. In the cold. Why?" Bobby's voice cracked for the first time. "I panicked. I thought nobody'd believe me. I put her in the car, drove her up to Hollow Creek. I left her there and, God forgive me, I just walked away." Family confrontation. When the news broke the next morning, the Kincaid family gathered outside the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and flashing cameras. Debbie's younger sister, Melissa Kincaid, now 58, had tears streaming down her face as she clutched a framed photo of Debbie, smiling, sun-kissed, her whole life ahead of her. "I can't believe it was him," Melissa whispered, shaking her head. "Bobby used to sit at our dinner table. He came to Christmas once. We trusted him. Debbie trusted him." Their mother, Carol Kincaid, now in her late 80s and in fragile health, didn't attend the press conference. But through a statement read by Melissa, she wrote, "After 40 years, my baby can finally rest. But this is not closure. There is no closure when your child is taken from you. There is only truth, and we finally have that." The weight of justice. The town of Meadowbrook reeled in the wake of the arrest. Neighbors who had lived alongside Bobby for decades suddenly viewed him through a different lens. Some expressed outrage, others, disbelief. Sheriff Tommy Rourke, who had joined the department in 1985 and worked cold cases for years, gave a short, somber statement. "This case haunted every investigator who ever worked it. We promised the Kincaid family we'd never stop looking for answers. Today, we kept that promise." Legal fallout. Bobby Creighton was charged with second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, abandonment of a corpse. During his first court appearance, his attorney argued that the death was an accident, a tragic argument spiraling out of control, not premeditated murder. Prosecutors, however, made it clear they intended to seek the maximum penalty. The trial date was set for January 2024, but for the Kincaid family, the long-awaited arrest was already a kind of justice. That night, as the sun set over Meadowbrook, Melissa Kincaid stood at her sister's grave for the first time in years. She traced the engraving on the weathered headstone. Debbie Lynn Kincaid. 1960 to 1983. Forever 23. She placed fresh lilies beneath the marker and whispered, voice trembling but steady. "We found him, Debbie. We finally found him." For the first time in 40 years, the cold night air felt just a little lighter. The trial of Gary Paul Reynolds, the man accused of murdering 23-year-old Debbie Kincaid in 1987, began on a gray Monday morning in late March 2025. The weather outside the Sullivan County Courthouse in Bristol, Tennessee, mirrored the mood inside, heavy, unsettled, and charged with decades of unanswered grief. Opening statements. Inside the packed courtroom, you could feel the tension before a single word was spoken. The benches were filled with reporters, Debbie's surviving family members, old friends, and curious residents who had lived under the shadow of this unsolved murder for nearly 4 decades. Assistant District Attorney Claire Monroe stood at the lectern, her voice steady but sharp. For 38 years, Debbie Kincaid's family has waited for justice. They waited through unanswered phone calls, sleepless nights, birthdays missed, holidays empty. All because this man, she said, pointing deliberately toward the defense table, thought he could take a young woman's life and disappear into the fog of time. But time, ladies and gentlemen, doesn't erase the truth. Science has caught up to Gary Reynolds. And the evidence you will see, the DNA, the recovered fibers, the inconsistencies in his alibis, will leave you with no reasonable doubt. Across the aisle, defense attorney Martin Greaves, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for dismantling forensic evidence, rose calmly. "This case isn't about justice," he said softly, almost sympathetically. "It's about desperation. The state failed to solve this crime for nearly 40 years. They have no eyewitnesses. They have no murder weapon. And they want you to believe that a few degraded DNA fragments, contaminated and mishandled for decades, are enough to convict a man and ruin what's left of his life. Ladies and gentlemen, Gary Reynolds is innocent. And we intend to prove it." The prosecution's case. The prosecution's strategy was clear: weave together science and history. The first days were spent reconstructing Debbie's final hours. Jurors heard from old friends, now middle-aged and weathered by time, who recounted that humid August night in 1987 when Debbie left her friend's apartment, saying she'd walked the 3 blocks home. Then came the forensics, the linchpin of the case. Dr. Emily Fraser, a state crime lab analyst, explained how a small DNA sample recovered from Debbie's blouse, long stored in a sealed evidence bag, had been retested using modern techniques. "The technology we used didn't exist in 1987, she told the jury. "Today, we can extract a profile from amounts of DNA that were once considered too small or degraded to test. And the profile we obtained was a direct match to Gary Reynolds." Photos of the blouse were displayed on a large screen, the faint stains circled in red. The jurors leaned forward, their eyes darting between the images and Reynolds, who sat motionless at the defense table, hands folded tightly in his lap. But it wasn't just the DNA. The prosecution introduced testimony from retired Detective James Mallory, one of the original investigators. He admitted that Reynolds had been questioned back in 1987 but was dismissed due to lack of physical evidence. "He lived less than half a mile from where Debbie's body was found," Mallory testified. "At the time, we had a gut feeling, but no way to prove it." The defense strikes back. Greaves countered aggressively. He called an independent forensic expert who challenged the chain of custody for the blouse, arguing that evidence stored improperly over decades can become compromised. "The integrity of this DNA sample cannot be guaranteed," the expert said. "Any number of factors, humidity, handling errors, cross-contamination, could have affected the result." Greaves also leaned heavily on the lack of a murder weapon, no eyewitnesses, and the decades-long gap between the crime and the arrest. And then came their wild card, an alternate suspect. The defense suggested that another man, Billy Red Harmon, a now-deceased drifter with a violent record, could have killed Debbie. They even produced old police notes indicating Harmon was questioned but released after providing an alibi that was never verified. The suggestion sent ripples through the courtroom, reopening old wounds and sowing doubt in the jurors' minds. Debbie's family takes the stand. The emotional weight of the trial came crashing down when Linda Kincaid, Debbie's younger sister, testified. Now in her late 50s, she gripped a folded tissue as she described the years of uncertainty and the toll it took on their family. "Every holiday, every birthday, would set a place for her at the table," Linda said, her voice cracking. "We thought someone would come forward. We thought someone would care enough to tell the truth. For 38 years, we waited. And now, finally, we're here." As she spoke, a few jurors wiped their own eyes. Even Reynolds, stoic throughout the trial, shifted uncomfortably. Closing arguments. After 3 grueling weeks, the case came down to competing narratives. The prosecution, science and circumstantial evidence aligned to point squarely at Reynolds. The defense, doubts about evidence handling, the possibility of another suspect, and the danger of convicting based on imperfect science. Monroe's final words were deliberate. "Debbie Kincaid has been silent for 38 years. But the evidence speaks for her now. Don't let her voice go unheard." Greaves, equally impassioned, warned the jury against letting grief and hindsight convict an innocent man. The verdict. After nearly 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. The courtroom was silent. You could hear the creak of wooden benches as people leaned forward. The four-person stood. We, the jury, find the defendant, Gary Paul Reynolds, guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps and muffled sobs filled the room. Debbie's sister Linda buried her face in her hands, shaking. Across the aisle, Reynolds sat stone-faced, staring at the table as if the words hadn't landed. Aftermath and healing. Reynolds was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Outside the courthouse, cameras swarmed, capturing raw emotion. Linda Kincaid, flanked by family, spoke through tears. We finally have justice for Debbie. But there's no closure. There never will be. Nothing can bring her back. For the Bristol community, the conviction closed a painful chapter, but it also reignited old fears. Conversations about evidence handling, long-forgotten suspects, and systemic failures dominated local news for weeks. Retired Detective Malloy reflected quietly to a reporter. I spent half my career haunted by this case. I always believed Gary Reynolds did it. But a part of me will always wonder, could we have stopped him if we'd done more back then? In the years since Debbie's death, Bristol had grown and changed, but this trial reminded everyone that the past never really stays buried. For the Kincaid family, justice came painfully late, but it came nonetheless. And for the investigators who reopened the case, the lesson was clear. Time erases nothing. Truth waits patiently for its day in court. The courtroom was silent, long after the verdict had been read. Dust particles floated lazily in the shafts of afternoon light streaming through the tall windows, settling over the worn wooden benches and scuffed floors. For Debbie Kincaid's family, the quiet wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. 42 years of unanswered questions had finally led to this moment, but closure was proving to be far more complicated than anyone had imagined. When the judge's gavel had fallen just hours earlier, finding Thomas Ray Whitaker guilty of the 1983 murder of Debbie Kincaid, a ripple of emotion swept through the packed room. There were tears, muffled sobs, and even gasps, but also a heavy stillness, as though everyone in that courtroom was grappling with the enormity of what had just been resolved. For Debbie's younger sister, Caroline Kincaid, now 61, the verdict was bittersweet. For so long, I dreamed about this day, she told reporters afterward, clutching a worn photograph of her sister taken just a week before her death. But I thought it would feel different. I thought I'd feel lighter somehow, but instead, I just keep thinking about all the years we lost. Generations scarred by silence. The Kincaid family had carried their grief like a hidden scar. In the years following Debbie's death, the family splintered under the weight of unanswered questions. Her parents, Margaret and Henry, passed away in the 1990s without ever knowing what happened to their daughter. Caroline, now a grandmother herself, admitted that the unresolved trauma seeped into every corner of their lives. Mom would set a place for Debbie at the table every Thanksgiving until the year she died, Caroline recalled in a trembling voice during her victim impact statement. We couldn't move forward, because a part of us was trapped in 1983. Now, as 3 generations gathered in the courthouse hallway, there was relief, yes, but also a profound sense of what justice could never return. Debbie never got to finish college. She never got married, never had children, never lived the life she deserved. That hole would never close. The investigator's perspective. Detective Laura Whitmore, the lead investigator in the cold case unit who had spearheaded the reopening of Debbie's file in 2021, stood quietly by the courthouse doors as the Kincaids embraced. For her, the case was a professional triumph but also deeply personal. This one haunted us, she admitted in a post-trial interview. Debbie's case was always on our radar, but we didn't have the technology back then. DNA evidence finally gave her a voice. Without it, Thomas Whitaker would have lived out the rest of his life free. She paused, her gaze softening. People think time dulls these cases, but it doesn't. It just buries them under more layers of grief. The FBI's forensic genealogy team had also played a pivotal role. Using DNA recovered from the scrap of Debbie's torn blouse, evidence stored in a dusty cardboard box for decades, they built out an extensive family tree that eventually pointed directly to Whitaker. The weight of a confession. When Whitaker finally broke during interrogation, his words were chillingly devoid of remorse. She wouldn't stop screaming, he muttered, his voice flat and distant, as if recounting a detail from someone else's life. I didn't mean to, but then it was done. To many, his confession raised more questions than answers. There was no elaborate motive, no grand conspiracy, just a predator who exploited opportunity. For Debbie's nieces and nephews, who grew up hearing only fragments of the family's pain, The revelation that their aunt's killer had lived undetected for 4 decades was a hard truth to swallow. "He got to walk free, build a life, while ours were frozen in that night," said Caroline's son, Michael, wiping tears from his face. "It doesn't seem fair. It never will." The broader impact. Debbie's case has already begun reshaping conversations around cold case investigations in rural communities like Hendersonville, North Carolina. The successful conviction has spurred local lawmakers to advocate for increased funding for cold case units and forensic genealogy programs statewide. In a recent press conference, District Attorney Erica Fulton spoke passionately about the lessons learned. "This is not just Debbie Kincaid's story, it's a reminder that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. With today's technology, no case is truly cold." Since Debbie's killer was arrested in 2023, 3 other cold cases in Henderson County have been reopened, with 2 now showing promising DNA leads. Confronting the myths. For decades, Debbie's murder had spawned countless local rumors. From whispered tales of a jealous ex-boyfriend to unfounded theories about a satanic cult operating in the Blue Ridge foothills, the lack of resolution gave rise to a kind of urban mythology. Detective Whitmore reflected on how these narratives shaped the investigation. People want to fill in the blanks. When they don't have answers, they make their own. But sometimes, the truth is quieter and far more brutal than the stories we tell ourselves. Whitaker wasn't a shadowy figure hiding in plain sight. He was a local handyman, a familiar face in the community. He'd lived just 3 miles from where Debbie's body was found, blending into the backdrop of ordinary life while her family searched for justice. A sister's final words. At the sentencing hearing, Caroline stood before the court, holding a folded piece of paper. Her voice wavered, but her words were clear. Debbie was more than a case file. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She loved poetry, old vinyl records, and hiking those trails where she took her last steps. You stole that from her, and from us. I hope every day of your life in prison reminds you of what you took. Whitaker stared blankly ahead, offering no apology. The silence in the room was deafening. Looking forward. 42 years is a long time to wait for justice. For the Kincaids, the verdict doesn't erase the pain, but it does offer something new, the possibility of moving forward. Caroline has since begun working with a non-profit organization dedicated to helping families of cold case victims navigate the long, grueling wait for answers. If sharing our story helps one other family keep hope alive, then maybe Debbie's death can mean something more, she said softly. The bigger picture. The resolution of Debbie Kincaid's case underscores a larger cultural shift in how law enforcement and society view cold cases. Advances in DNA technology, public genealogical databases, and persistent investigative work have rewritten the boundaries of what's possible. But beyond the science, it's a reminder of something deeply human, that memory endures. For families like the Kincaids, time didn't heal the wound, but justice, however delayed, offered the first step toward acceptance. As Detective Whitmore put it best during her final press briefing, every scrap of evidence matters. Every forgotten box in the evidence room holds a story waiting to be heard. Debbie's voice was silent for 42 years, but today, she was heard. Outside the courthouse, as the autumn sun dipped behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, Caroline and her family gathered quietly, Debbie's photograph at the center of their circle. It wasn't closure, but it was something. Justice, fragile, imperfect, and decades late, had finally arrived. The heavy oak doors of the courthouse creaked shut as the last of the spectators filed out, their murmurs fading into the late afternoon air. It was over. After 43 years, Debbie Kincaid's name had finally been given the justice it deserved. Her killer was behind bars, the evidence airtight, and for the first time since 1981, her family could breathe without the weight of unanswered questions crushing their chests. And yet, something still didn't sit right. Detective Mark Ellison leaned against the cold marble wall of the courthouse lobby, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat. The afternoon sunlight poured through the tall windows, but it did nothing to warm him. He should have felt closure. Relief. Triumph, even. Instead, there was that gnawing sensation again, the same one he'd felt on the night they first reopened the Kincaid file. Debbie's case wasn't just about Debbie. His gut whispered. It never was. He turned as Linda Kincaid, Debbie's younger sister, approached. Her face was pale, drained from the emotional toll of the trial, but her eyes burned with something other than grief. "Detective," she said softly, glancing around to make sure no one else was within earshot. "I need to show you something." Ellison frowned. "Linda, you should go home, get some rest." "No," she interrupted, clutching her worn leather purse to her chest. This can't wait. From inside, she pulled a small yellowed envelope, the edges brittle from decades of neglect. This was sent to my parents 2 months after Debbie's murder, she whispered. We found it in an old box while cleaning out my father's attic. Allison's brow furrowed. What is it? Linda hesitated, then carefully handed it to him. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink faded but still legible. No name, no signature, just one chilling line. Debbie wasn't the first. She won't be the last. Allison's stomach dropped. He glanced at Linda. Why didn't anyone see this before? My parents, they never told anyone. Mom thought it was just some cruel prank. Linda's voice cracked. But what if it wasn't? Allison folded the note carefully and slid it into his pocket. His mind was already racing, pieces falling into place that he hadn't even realized were missing. Because there had been whispers. Old rumors about 2 other young women who'd vanished in nearby counties around the same time as Debbie. Cases dismissed as runaways, forgotten over the decades. And then there was something else, something buried deep in the Kincaid files that suddenly seemed far less like coincidence. That night, Allison sat in his office surrounded by old case boxes, the glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the building's heating system. He flipped through photocopies, autopsy reports, witness statements, until one photo stopped him cold. A crime scene photo. Not Debbie's. This one dated 1979, 2 years before her murder. Different county. Different victim. But there it was, clear as day. The same distinctive symbol carved into the bark of a tree near the body. The same one they'd found at Debbie Kincaid's crime scene. Allison leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as the truth settled over him like ice water. This wasn't over. Debbie's killer had confessed, yes. But someone else had been out there, working long before her death, and possibly long after. And if that anonymous note was right, there might still be another victim waiting to be found. Allison pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. When the voice on the other end picked up, he said just 4 words. We've got another one. The screen fades to black. But just before the outro rolls, a cold caption appears across the screen. Coming next, the cold case no one wanted to touch, 3 missing women, 1 small town, and a killer who never left.